Picture a borderland at dusk, red dust hanging in the air, distant campfires flickering like dying stars, and the constant knowledge that tomorrow might bring riders, rifles, or nothing at all. In that fragile hush, a woman hears a voice she's been warned to fear. Slow, steady, spoken from far away under moonlight. You are safe. Night after night. No demand, no threat, just those words planted like seeds in ground that had known only violence. This is the true story of how patience outlasted anger, how a whisper became louder than any shouted command, and how two people, one settler, one Apache, found something worth more than land or pride. It's not easy. It's not pretty. But it's real. And it starts right now. The night pressed down on the New Mexico border, like a heavy wool blanket soaked in dust. Inside the small canvas tent at the edge of the settlement, Lila Boone lay rigid on her thin pallet, eyes wide in the dark. The air smelled of dry sage and horse sweat carried on the wind, and the wooden stakes creaking against the guy ropes sounded too much like footsteps. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped once, sharp and lonely, then fell silent. She had not slept properly since they brought her here, since the raid that left smoke on the horizon and blood on the ground. The settlers called it protection, keeping her in this tent for her own good. Lila knew better. Protection felt a lot like a cage with no lock. The wind shifted, rustling the canvas, and there it was again, that low, steady murmur drifting in from the darkness beyond the firelight. Not loud, not close, just persistent, like water wearing stone. The same three words, spoken slow and careful, as though the speaker feared breaking something fragile. You are safe. Lila's breath caught. She pressed the rough wool blanket tighter across her chest, fingers white-knuckled. The town had warned her. Harlan Wade himself, standing in the doorway that first evening with his hat in his hands and his voice flat. Don't listen to him, Miss Boone. Apache words are traps. He'll twist your mind till you think black is white. And she wanted to believe it, wanted to hate the sound. But the whisper carried no threat, no demand, no edge of hunger. It simply repeated, patient, the same way a mother might hush a frightened child long after the nightmare had faded. She squeezed her eyes shut, tried to block it out. The effort only made her more aware of every small sound. The pop of dying embers at the distant cook fire, the faint jingle of a horse shifting in the remuda, the dry scrape of mesquite branches against one another. And underneath it all, that voice, low, measured, English spoken with the slight hesitation of someone who had practiced the words alone in the dark. You are safe. Lila's heart thudded against her ribs. She could picture him out there, tall, lean, standing motionless under the moon-washed sky. She had glimpsed him at dawn. High cheekbones, long black hair tied back, hands open at his sides, never closer than the length of 3 wagons. Never a step nearer. Never a word in daylight. She told herself it was a trick. Told herself the calm spreading through her chest was only exhaustion playing games. But when the whisper paused for a heartbeat, as though waiting for her breathing to steady, she felt the knot of fear loosen just enough to draw air. Then it began again. You are safe. She did not scream for help, did not rise and shout into the night. The thought of Buck Harlan or Jed Cole rushing over with lanterns and rifles, their faces hard with suspicion, made her stomach turn. They would look at her the way they looked at strays that had gone feral. Pity mixed with wariness. So she stayed still. Let the words settle over her like dust after a hard ride. The whisper continued, soft and unhurried, until the moon slid behind a ridge and the sky turned the color of old iron. Then It stopped. Silence rushed in, thick and sudden. Lila waited, ears straining. Nothing but wind and the faint creak of the tent poles. She exhaled, shaky, rolled onto her side, closed her eyes. And then, faint at first, growing steadier, the rhythmic thud of hooves approaching from the direction of the main settlement. Not fast, not panicked, just deliberate. Someone was coming. Lila sat up slowly, blanket falling away. Her pulse hammered in her throat. The whisper had fallen silent, but the tall shadow she remembered from earlier still stood out there, unmoving, watchful, between her and the approaching rider. She stared into the dark, mouth dry. Was he guarding her, or waiting for the right moment to strike? The hoofbeats drew nearer, steady as a heartbeat, and the first pale edge of lantern light flickered against the canvas wall. The sun rose pale and thin over the Mimbres River flats, painting the dust a dull gold that did nothing to warm the morning chill. Lila Boone pushed aside the tent flap and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel still damp with night dew. The settlement was already stirring. A woman in a faded calico apron pumped water at the well, the handle squeaking in rhythm. A boy chased a stray chicken between the wagons. Men moved slow, rifles slung over shoulders like old habits they couldn't shake. Every pair of eyes that caught hers lingered a beat too long, curious, wary, pitying, before sliding away. She felt the weight of those looks like stones in her pockets. Out on the flat, maybe 200 yards distant, Cochise stood motionless against the horizon. Tall, lean, dark hair tied back with a strip of leather, blanket draped loose over one shoulder. He faced the east, eyes lowered, hands open at his sides. Not watching her, not watching anyone. Just there. The same place he'd been at first light yesterday, and the day before that. Lila's stomach twisted. She told herself she hated him for the whisper that had slipped into her dreams last night, soft and steady, pulling her out of the black panic that always came when she closed her eyes. She told herself the calm it left behind was a lie, a trick, just like Harlan said. But her body remembered different. Beside the tent pole, a tin cup of water sat next to a small bundle wrapped in clean muslin, cornbread, a strip of jerked venison, a few dried apricots. No note, no footprint closer than the ones already fading in the dust. She stared at the offering, throat tight. If she threw it away, she proved something, to herself, maybe to the eyes still watching from the cook fire. Proved she wasn't bending. But the gnawing in her belly reminded her she hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, and refusing meant growing weaker in a place where weakness drew wolves of a different kind. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the cup. The water was cool, clean. No metallic bite from the settlement well. She drank half in one long swallow, then tore a piece of cornbread and forced it down. The taste was simple, honest. It settled like guilt in her chest. Harlan Wade's boots scuffed the dirt behind her. She didn't turn, but she felt him stop a respectful distance away, close enough to speak low, far enough not to crowd. "Don't listen to him, Miss Boone," he said, voice rough from tobacco and years of shouting over wind. "They use words like that to soften you up. Next thing you know, you're walking out into the dark with him, and we're burying what's left." Lila kept her eyes on the horizon. "I'm not walking anywhere." Harlan grunted. "Hope you mean that. Jed and the boys were talking raids again last night. Old ones, fresh ones. Doesn't matter. Blood remembers." Across the flat, Jed Cole leaned against a wagon tongue, talking low to another rider. Their glances flicked toward her, then toward Cochise. Jed's hand rested easy on the butt of his Colt, thumb brushing the hammer like a man checking a promise. Lila turned back into the tent, heart thudding too loud in her ears. She set the cup down carefully, as though it might break. The air inside smelled of canvas and old fear sweat, hers mostly. Then it came. Soft. Earlier than before. Drifting through the open flap on the morning breeze. "You are safe." Lila froze. The words weren't louder, weren't closer. Just there, in daylight, where they had no business being. She stepped to the doorway and looked out. Cochise hadn't moved. Still facing east, still distant, still calm. But Jed Cole had straightened. His eyes narrowed on the tall figure across the flat. His hand slid fully onto the revolver grip, fingers curling slow. Lila stood in the shadow of the tent, breath shallow, watching the space between the three of them stretch thin and taut as a bowstring. The whisper came again, quiet, unhurried. "You are safe." And in the silence that followed, she heard the faint, metallic click of a hammer being eased back. The wind came harder that second night, sweeping down from the ridges like a broom made of sand and regret. It rattled the tent stakes, slapped canvas against canvas, and drove fine grit through every seam until Lila tasted dust on her tongue, even with her mouth closed. Inside the small space, the air hung thick. Old sweat, kerosene from the lamp she hadn't dared light, and the faint, lingering sweetness of dried apricots she'd eaten earlier against her better judgment. She lay on her back, blanket pulled to her chin, staring at the sagging roof where shadows danced with every gust. The fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest, the same fear that had kept her awake since the raid, since the smoke and the screams and the moment she realized safety was just a word people said to feel better. But tonight, the fear had a small crack in it, a thin, unwelcome fissure, because part of her, small, traitorous, was waiting. She hated that part. Far off, a rifle cracked once, sharp, flat against the wind. Not close enough to be aimed at anything living in the settlement. Probably a hunter dropping a jackrabbit or a sentry reminding the dark who held the line. But the sound carried memory. Victorio's men had ridden these flats not long ago. Remnants still drifting like smoke after a fire. The settlers whispered about it at supper. Apache still out there, watching, waiting. Lila had heard the talk through the tent walls earlier, low voices laced with whiskey and worry. She pulled the blanket tighter, wool scratching her cheek. Her fingers found the frayed edge and worried it, thread by thread. She told herself she would not listen tonight, would not let the words in, but the seconds stretched, and her breathing slowed against her will, ears straining for the sound she swore she despised. Then it came, soft at first, almost lost in the wind, but steady. The same three words, spoken slower than before, as though each syllable were being planted carefully in the ground. "You are safe." He repeated it. Again. Again. Not rushing, not louder. Just patient, like rain on dry earth, wearing its way in whether she wanted it or not. Lila's throat tightened. There was no command in the voice, no hunger, no threat. Only the quiet insistence of someone who knew fear did not leave in a single night. She closed her eyes, tried to shut it out, but the words kept coming, steady as a heartbeat she could not silence. Her mind drifted to the tall shadow she had seen at dawn. Hands open, never closer, never demanding. And for the first time, a small, terrible thought slipped through. What if he meant it? She counted the repetitions without meaning to. 10, 12, 15. Each one chipped at the wall she had built. She hated herself for counting, hated the way her shoulders eased, just a fraction, when the whisper rolled over her again. Then it stopped. The wind howled on, but the voice was gone. Silence rushed back in, colder than before. Lila exhaled. Shaky. She rolled onto her side, pulled her knees up, tried to force sleep. A soft crunch outside the tent, boots on gravel. Careful, deliberate. Not the measured stillness of Cochise, who never approached. These steps were closer. Hesitant. Human. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She froze, listening. The footsteps paused just beyond the flap, close enough that she could hear the faint rustle of clothing shifting in the wind. Not Cochise. Cochise was still out there, far, watchful, silent. So who was standing outside her tent in the dark? Lila held her breath, eyes fixed on the canvas wall, waiting for the shadow to move, for a hand to lift the flap, for whatever came next. The wind gusted again, and the footsteps did not retreat. The afternoon sun bled low across the flats, turning the dust to a slow burning red that clung to everything it touched. Lila Boone sat just inside the open flap of her tent, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them like she could hold herself together that way. The wind had died down to a restless murmur, carrying the faint metallic tang of iron from the distant well and the sharper bite of mesquite smoke drifting from the cook fire. Shadows stretched long and thin, reaching toward her like fingers she didn't want to acknowledge. Out there, maybe 250 yards now, farther than yesterday, Cochise stood in the same quiet way. Blanket loose over his shoulders, head slightly bowed against the glare. He hadn't moved since noon. She knew because she had looked. More than once. She hated that she looked. The calm the whispers had left in her last night lingered like a bruise, tender, impossible to ignore. She told herself it was weakness, that the words were poison dressed up as comfort, the way Harlan had warned. But the truth sat heavier. For the first time in weeks, she had woken without the sharp gasp of remembered gunfire in her ears. And that small mercy felt like betrayal. Harlan Wade's boots scuffed the dirt path behind her. He stopped a few paces off, close enough that she caught the scent of tobacco and old leather. Buck Harlan lingered a step behind, silent, arms crossed. Harlan cleared his throat, low. "She's starting to listen to him," he said, not to Lila, but to his brother, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "If we don't get a handle on this, she'll drag the whole damn settlement into the fire with her." Buck grunted something short, a sound more animal than word. Lila kept her eyes on the horizon, cheeks burning. She wanted to turn and snap that she wasn't listening, that she hated the voice in the dark, but the lie stuck in her throat. Instead, she stayed still, letting the accusation settle over her like dust. A tin canteen sat beside the tent pole, fresh water, clearer than the brackish stuff from the settlement well. No footprints led to it. The sand around was smooth except for the faint press of a single handprint on the metal. Clean and deliberate. He had wiped the canteen before setting it down. The thought made her chest ache in a way she couldn't name. She reached for it slowly, fingers brushing the cool surface. The handprint was larger than hers, steady. She lifted the canteen, drank, and felt the water slide down like forgiveness she hadn't asked for. Guilt followed right behind it, sharp as a thorn. She tried not to look toward Cochise again. Tried. But her gaze drifted anyway. Quick, guilty glances that left her feeling smaller each time. each look chipped away at the fear she had clung to like armor. She was losing control of it, piece by piece, and the worst part was how much she didn't want to stop. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised oranges and purples. Shadows merged, blurred. And then, earlier than ever, the whisper drifted in on the cooling air. "You are safe." Softer than before, tired almost. And beneath it, so faint she might have imagined it, a single quiet exhale, like a man who had carried something heavy too long, letting his breath go. Lila's lips parted. The words slipped out before she could catch them, barely a breath. "Why are you doing this?" The whisper stopped, not faded, not trailed off. Stopped. A long second stretched, empty except for the low moan of wind through the sage. Cochise hadn't moved, but the stillness felt different now, attentive, as though the desert itself had paused to listen. Lila sat frozen, heart loud in her ears, waiting for the words to return, waiting to see if she had just broken something that could never be mended. The sun slipped behind the ridge, and the first stars pricked the sky like distant campfires. The whisper did not come back. The third night came in cold and mean, the kind of cold that found every seam in the canvas and slipped inside like a blade. Lila Boone lay curled beneath the blanket, knees tucked high, the wool pulled tight across her shoulders until it felt like a second skin. The wind cut sharp across the flats, whistling through the sage and rattling the distant corral poles like bones. Far off, the settlement's cook fire flickered low and sullen, throwing orange sparks that died before they reached the dark. She hadn't slept. Not really, since the raid. The memories still came in flashes. Smoke thick enough to choke on, horses screaming, the wet thud of bodies hitting dirt. But tonight the fear felt different, less like a noose, more like a weight she was learning to carry. And beneath it, something quieter was growing. A need. The whispers had become the only thing that let her breathe deep enough to close her eyes without drowning. She hated admitting it, even to herself. Earlier that day, May Harlan had come. The woman moved quiet, like she didn't want the ground to know she was there. She'd left a small hunk of cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth beside the tent flap. No words at first, just the soft scrape of her boots stopping. Then, low, almost lost in the wind. "You ought to be careful, Lila. Harlan don't like this spreading. Folks are talking." May's eyes had flicked toward the distant figure on the flat. Cochise, still as stone, blanket loose against the afternoon glare. Fear was in her gaze, sure, but something else, too. A flicker of curiosity, maybe even pity. Lila had taken the bread without looking up. She'd torn off a piece and chewed slow, tasting the faint sweetness of lard and the bitterness of being watched. Every bite felt like a confession she couldn't voice. She'd wanted to say thank you. The words had risen in her throat, warm and simple, but she'd swallowed them instead. A nod. That was all she'd given when May turned to go. A small, secret thing, enough to keep the door cracked. Not enough to swing it wide. Now, in the dark, the blanket felt thinner. The cold pressed harder. Lila stared at the canvas ceiling, listening to her own breathing slow against her will. The whisper came then, clearer tonight, each word shaped with care, like a man repeating a prayer he was still learning. "You are safe." He said it again. Again. Slow, deliberate, as though he were planting each syllable deep enough to take root. Lila's eyes stung, She shifted, peering through the narrow gap in the flap. There he was, tall shadow against the star-pricked sky. No extra wrap against the wind, no fire to warm his hands. The blanket he wore was the same thin one from daylight. He stood in the open, taking the full bite of the cold so he wouldn't step any closer. The realization settled in her chest like lead. He was suffering the night so she wouldn't have to feel watched too close. She swallowed hard. The ache behind her ribs spread. The words kept coming, steady as a slow heartbeat. You are safe. She let them in this time. Didn't fight. Just lay there and let the sound wash over her until her eyelids grew heavy. Then it stopped. The wind howled on, but the voice was gone. Lila exhaled, long and shaky. She closed her eyes, waiting for sleep to claim her. A heavier tread broke the night, boots on gravel, deliberate, coming from the direction of the settlement. Not the light step of May, not Jed Cole's quick stride. This was slower, heavier. A lantern bobbed into view beyond the flap, yellow light swinging like a pendulum. Harlan Wade. Lila's heart lurched. She went still, breath trapped in her throat, listening as the footsteps drew nearer, the lantern's glow creeping across the canvas like spilled honey. He was coming straight for her tent. The light stopped just outside. A shadow loomed tall against the wall. Lila stared at it, pulse roaring in her ears. What did he want now? The lantern light hit the canvas first, a warm, unsteady glow that pushed the cold back just enough to make the shadows sharper. Lila Boone lay rigid, breath shallow, as the heavy boots stopped outside the flap. The flame hissed softly, fed by a fresh wick, and Harlan Wade's silhouette loomed tall and square against the wall. Broad shoulders, hat brim low, the kind of man who carried authority the way other men carried rifles. He didn't knock. Didn't need to. "Lila Boone," he called, voice low but carrying like a whip crack in the quiet night. "I know you're awake. Step out here." She didn't move at first. The blanket felt suddenly too thin, the air inside the tent too close. Fear surged back, cold and familiar, clawing up her throat the way it had the night of the raid. But this time, it wasn't alone. Beneath it, steady as a distant drum, lingered the echo of the whisper that had just fallen silent. It had left something behind, the faint, stubborn sense that she wasn't entirely alone in the dark anymore. She pushed the blanket aside, sat up slowly, and crawled to the flap. When she lifted it, the lantern light struck her face like a slap. Harlan stood there, eyes narrowed under the brim, jaw set. Buck Harlan loomed a pace behind, hand resting easy on the butt of his revolver. Gaze locked on the tall, motionless figure. Far out on the flat. Cochise, still as stone under the stars. Harlan's voice dropped lower, meant for her alone. "Word's getting around. Folks say you're starting to listen to him. That whisper in the night. If you don't put a stop to it, I'll have to take you into town proper. Safer there. Away from influences." The word hung heavy, laced with something darker than concern. Lila's mouth went dry. She kept her eyes on Harlan's boots, scuffed, dust-caked, planted wide like he owned the ground beneath them. If she looked toward Cochise, even for a second, Harlan would see it, would know. And then what? More riders? More guns? She swallowed, tasting the lie before it left her lips. "I don't hear anything," she said. The words came out small, trembling at the edges. Each one felt like a cut she was making on herself, another small piece of truth pared away. Harlan studied her a long moment. The lantern flame dipped and flared, throwing his face into harsh relief, lines carved deep by years of hard choices and harder regrets. "Hope that's the truth, girl, because if it ain't, we'll find out soon enough." Buck shifted his weight, leather creaking. His thumb brushed the hammer of the Colt once, casual, like checking the weather. Harlan turned then, slow and deliberate, lantern swinging as he started back toward the settlement. Buck followed, boots scraping gravel. Lila stayed in the doorway, knees weak, heart hammering so loud she thought they must hear it. The lantern light receded, swallowed by the dark, leaving only the faint orange glow of the distant cook fire. Silence settled again, thick and cold. Then, soft, immediate, as though it had been waiting, the whisper returned. "You are safe." It drifted in on the wind, clearer than before, close enough that she could almost feel the breath behind it. This time she didn't reach for the blanket, didn't cover her ears. She let the words come, let them settle over her skin like the first warm rain after drought. She exhaled, long and shaky. Harlan stopped halfway down the path. The lantern halted, swung back. His voice carried across the flat, rough and final. "Tomorrow I'll be back. With more than just words. You think hard on that, Lila." He turned again and kept walking. The light bobbed smaller, smaller, until it merged with the firelight of the settlement. Lila stood in the open flap, arms wrapped tight around herself against the cold. She looked out across the dark expanse. Cochise was still there, distant, unmoving, but now his head was bowed slightly, as though listening for something only he could hear, as though waiting for her. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine, and the night held its breath. The morning came quiet, almost too quiet, as though the whole settlement held its breath after Harlan's threat the night before. A thin mist clung low over the flats, muting the first pale light and turning the dust silver gray. Lila Boone sat just inside the open flap of her tent, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them against the lingering chill. The air smelled of wet sage and cold wood smoke from last night's dying fires. No one moved much yet. Even the horses in the remuda stood still, heads low, as if they knew something heavy was coming. Out on the flat, Cochise remained. Farther than yesterday, a tall, dark line against the horizon. Blanket draped loose, head bowed slightly. He hadn't moved since before dawn. Lila watched him longer than she meant to, the sight settling into her like a stone in deep water. The whispers weren't just sounds anymore. They were care. Quiet, stubborn, costing him something she could see in the way he took the cold without complaint. She couldn't pretend to hate them now, not without lying to herself, and she was tired of lies. Footsteps approached, soft, careful. May Harlan appeared from the mist, carrying a tin cup of water in both hands like an offering. Her shawl was pulled tight, face pale, eyes wide with the kind of worry that ages a woman fast. She stopped a few feet away, glanced once toward Cochise, then back to Lila. May set the cup down on the flat stone by the flap. Her voice came out low, barely above the wind. "Harlan's been talking. Says if you don't cut it off with him," she nodded once toward the distant figure, "they'll send for riders from the big town. They'll call you a traitor. Folks won't look the other way much longer." Lila stared at the cup. The water shimmered, clean and cold. She reached for it slowly, fingers brushing May's as she took it. When she lifted her eyes, they drifted, unbidden, guilty, toward Cochise. Just a glance, but May saw it. The older woman's shoulders sagged. She shook her head once, slow and sad, lips pressed thin. Jed Cole walked past then, slow and deliberate, rifle slung over his shoulder. His gaze slid across Lila like a blade, cold, contemptuous, before he spat into the dust and kept going toward the corral. Lila's throat tightened. She wanted to cut it off, to tell May she'd stop listening, stop looking, stop letting the words in. It would keep her name clean in their eyes, keep the settlement from turning on her completely. But the thought of silence, of nights empty of that steady voice, felt like losing the only hand reaching toward her in the dark. She drank from the cup, slow. The water tasted faintly of iron and mountain snow. When she lowered it, her voice came out small, cracked. "I don't know what to do." May looked at her a long moment, eyes glistening. Then she turned to go. Beside the tent pole, a small bundle waited. Jerked meat, a piece of flatbread, and a folded strip of clean wool cloth. Soft, warm, meant to wrap against the wind. No footprints close, just the faint press of careful hands. He had seen her strain last night. He had answered without words. Lila unfolded the cloth slowly. It smelled faintly of piñón smoke and clean air. She pressed it to her cheek for a second, eyes stinging. Then, barely audible, the word slipped out. "Thank you." May froze mid-step. She spun back, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent gasp. For a heartbeat, neither moved. May's gaze flicked from Lila to the distant figure on the flat, then back again. She said nothing, just shook her head once more, sharper this time, and hurried away through the mist. Lila watched her go. May's path curved toward the main fire, where Harlan Wade stood, arms crossed, staring out across the flats. He hadn't seen. Not yet. But May was walking straight to him. Lila's fingers tightened on the cloth. The morning light strengthened, burning away the mist inch by inch, and out there Cochise lifted his head, just a fraction, as though he felt the shift in the air. The settlement began to wake around her, slow and reluctant, but the quiet between them felt thinner now. Fragile and breaking, the late afternoon wind came hard out of the west, whipping dust into stinging red veils that stung the eyes and coated the tongue with grit. Lila Boone stood just outside the tent flap, boots planted in the loose sand, arms loose at her sides as though she didn't know what else to do with them. The sun hung low, bloated and angry, throwing long shadows that stretched across the flats like accusations. Cochise was there, far enough to honor the unspoken line, close enough now that she could make out the faint rise and fall of his blanket with each breath. He hadn't moved since morning. May Harlan stood a few paces to her left, shawl clutched tight, face pale beneath the brim of her sunbonnet. "Lila," she whispered, urgent and low. "Don't. Harlan's watching. Buck, too. They're waiting for you to give them a reason." Lila didn't answer. Her gaze stayed fixed on the tall figure against the bruised sky. The whispers had carved something into her over these nights, something quiet and stubborn that refused to be buried again. If she stayed silent now, let the fear win one more time, she knew she would lose the last piece of herself that still felt like hers. But speaking, out loud, in daylight where everyone could hear, meant burning the bridge back to the settlement, to safety, to belonging. From across the flat, Harlan Wade's voice rolled in like thunder on flat ground. "Lila Boone!" He stood near the main fire pit, legs wide, hat pushed back. Buck Harlan flanked him, hand already on the Colt at his hip, thumb resting easy on the hammer. "If you're still listening to that buck out there," Harlan shouted. "We'll call you complicit. Apache lover. You won't be safe here anymore. Not with us. Not with anybody." Buck drew the revolver halfway from leather, a slow, deliberate warning, and held it low, barrel pointed toward the ground but ready. A few settlers paused in their chores. A woman at the well froze with the bucket half raised. A boy near the corral stared wide-eyed. Eyes turned. Whispers started. Lila's stomach lurched. The wind tore at her skirt, pushed hair across her face. She could still step back inside the tent, could still hide in silence and keep the thin shield of victim wrapped around her. They might forgive that. Eventually. But Cochise had never asked for anything. Never pushed. Never taken. Only given. Night after night. Cold after cold. Distance after distance. She took one step forward. Then another. Out of the tent's shadow. Into the open. The settlement watched. May reached out, fingers brushing Lila's sleeve, but didn't hold her back. Lila lifted her chin. Her voice came out small at first, trembling, then steadier. "Thank you," she said, loud enough to carry across the wind. "For those nights, for keeping me safe." The words hung there, raw and naked in the daylight. Cochise went still, his head lowered a fraction, not submission, not defeat, just acknowledgement. He did not speak, did not step closer. The respectful space between them remained, solid as ever. May's hand dropped away. Her eyes filled, red-rimmed, shining. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. Harlan Wade's face darkened to the color of old blood. He started forward, boots kicking up dust, each step heavy with fury. "What the hell did you just do, girl?" His voice cracked like dry wood. "From this moment on, you ain't one of us anymore." Buck Harlan raised the revolver fully now, barrel leveled toward Cochise. Steady, unhurried, finger resting outside the trigger guard, but close. Too close. Lila stood between them all. Between the settlement and the man who had whispered her through the dark. Heart slamming against her ribs, mouth dry as the dust at her feet. There was no going back. The wind howled once, sharp and mournful, and the shadows stretched longer, reaching for whatever came next. The night after the words left her mouth felt heavier, as though the sky itself had pressed down closer. Lila Boone lay on her pallet inside the tent, the flap tied halfway open so the cool air could slip in without invitation. The canvas walls breathed with the wind, faint creaks and sighs like an old house settling. Outside, the settlement had gone unnaturally quiet. No laughter from the cook fire, no clink of tin cups, only the low crackle of embers dying slow. The smell of pine smoke lingered, thin and acrid, mixing with the dry dust that never quite left anything alone. She stared at the gap in the flap. Cochise was still out there. Closer tonight, maybe 20 yards nearer than before, the first time he had ever moved the line. Not enough to touch, never enough to threaten, but enough that she could see the faint outline of his shoulders against the starlight. He stood with the same stillness, blanket wrapped tight against the chill, but the adjustment felt like a quiet answer to what she had said in daylight. He had heard. He had chosen to answer without crossing the boundary. Lila's chest ached with something new. Not fear exactly, but the raw edge of knowing she had crossed her own line. No going back to the girl who hid behind silence. The settlement's eyes had burned into her back all afternoon. No one spoke to her after Harlan's words. No nods, no passing greetings, only averted gazes and the slow widening of space around her tent. She had lost the thin belonging she'd clung to, the illusion that she still fit here. May Harlan was the only one who still came. And even May moved like a thief in her own home. The distant thunder of hooves rolled in from the east, slow at first, then steadier. Not one horse, several. Riders from the bigger town, coming on Harlan's order. Lila's pulse quickened. She sat up slowly, blanket pooling in her lap. A soft rustle outside. May again, slipping through the shadows like she belonged to them. She crouched just beyond the flap, voice a threadbare whisper. "They're coming at first light. Harlan swore it, said he'll take you by force if he has to. You can't stay here, Lila. Not after today." Lila looked toward Cochise. He hadn't moved, but she felt the weight of his presence like a hand on her shoulder. Steady, unyielding. Running alone into the desert meant starvation, exposure, or worse. Staying meant the riders would call it abduction, would drag Cochise into their story of violence whether he raised a hand or not. Every choice carried blood on its edges. She drew a long breath, tasting dust and cold. "I won't leave," she whispered into the dark. "I won't go." May's silhouette sagged. She didn't argue. Just reached through the gap and squeezed Lila's hand once, cold fingers trembling, then pulled back and melted into the night. Silence returned, thick and watchful. Then the whisper came, soft, close enough to feel personal tonight. "You are safe." It repeated, slow and familiar, but after the third time, something new threaded through it. "I am here." The words were halting, accented, spoken like they had been practiced in solitude. Not a promise of rescue, not a claim, just truth. Lila's lips curved in the dark, a small, broken smile she didn't know she still had. The whisper faded. She lay back, eyes on the open flap, listening to the night. The hoofbeats grew louder, not distant thunder anymore, but a steady rhythm closing in. Multiple horses, lanterns bobbed on the horizon, small yellow eyes in the black. May's voice returned, urgent, right outside the tent. "They're early. Lila, you have to decide, right now." Lila didn't move. She stared at the approaching lights, heart steady for the first time in days. The riders were coming, and she was still here. The morning broke cold and thin, the kind of dawn that carried frost on its breath and left the ground hard underfoot. Lila Boone stepped out of the tent into a settlement already edged with unease. Wagons creaked as men shifted supplies. Women drew water in hurried buckets. Children were kept close, voices hushed. The riders from the bigger town had arrived before first light. Jed Cole at their head. 6 men in dusty coats and low-slung guns, now pitching a rough camp just beyond the corral. Their horses stamped, breath steaming white in the chill air. The smell of fresh coffee from their fire mixed with the sharp bite of horse sweat and oiled leather. Out on the flat, Cochise stood farther back than last night, a solitary dark shape against the pale sky. But he was not alone anymore. Higher on the ridge, 2 more figures waited. Apache remnant band, blankets wrapped tight, rifles cradled easy but ready. They watched without moving, shadows among the scrub pine. Lila felt the shift in her bones. If she stayed quiet now, let the riders take her without a word. The fragile thing she and Cochise had built would crumble, and the settlement would pay for it too. Water cut, trails blocked, lives squeezed until something broke. Silence wasn't peace anymore. It was surrender. Jed Cole stepped forward from his camp, boots crunching gravel, voice carrying loud enough for every ear in the settlement. "If Miss Boone don't walk away from that buck right now," he said, We'll close the water trail and the main path. No one in, no one out. This town can't feed a traitor. And his people," he jerked his chin toward Cochise, then the ridge. "They'll lose their hunting ground for good if this keeps up." Harlan Wade stood beside him, arms folded, nodding slow and heavy. His finger pointed toward Cochise, without flourish, just fact. "He keeps this up. They all pay." The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples spread. A woman at the well paused mid-pump. A man by the corral tightened his grip on a rope. Eyes turned to Lila, some pitying, some hard, most simply afraid. She walked forward before the fear could root her boots. The ground felt unsteady, but she kept her chin level. Jed Cole watched her approach, one eyebrow lifted, hand resting easy on his belt. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Her voice shook at first, then steadied, clear enough to carry. "I'm staying." A murmur ran through the settlement. Sharp intakes, low curses. Jed's mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a grin. Harlan's jaw tightened. Lila felt the last thread of protection snap. No more food slipped under the flap from sympathetic hands. No more nods in passing. She had chosen, and the choice carried weight. Real, heavy, immediate. She looked at Jed. "I won't let them take everything because of me." Jed laughed once, short and dry. He turned away, waving a hand at his men. "Set up on the water trail. Block it clean." Ropes uncoiled, stakes driven, canvas stretched. The camp shifted, deliberate and final. May Harlan stood near the edge of the crowd, eyes red-rimmed, face drawn. She stepped closer to Lila, voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing, child? But I understand." Lila met her gaze for a second, grateful, grieving, then looked back across the flat. Cochise hadn't moved, but she saw it. His right hand lifted, palm open, a small, deliberate gesture. Not a wave, not a plea, just understanding. Acceptance of whatever cost came next. The wind rose, carrying dust and the faint scent of piñon from the rider's fire. Then, soft beneath it all, the whisper drifted in, closer than before, intimate in the open air. "You are safe." A pause. "We, together." Lila's throat closed. She stared at him, the distance between them suddenly smaller, not because he had stepped forward, but because the world had pushed them both into the same narrow ground. Jed Cole's men hammered the last stake into place. The water trail was blocked, and out on the ridge, the two shadows shifted, watching, waiting. The late afternoon sun hung low and merciless, turning the dust into a choking red haze that settled over everything like a shroud. The settlement had fallen into an unnatural hush. No hammers ringing at the corral, no children calling, only the low moan of wind through the sage and the occasional creak of a wagon settling on dry axles. The water trail was blocked, stakes driven deep, ropes taut, canvas flapping like flags of surrender. Thirst was already creeping in, lips cracked, voices hoarse, the faint metallic smell of fear mixing with the dry earth. Lila Boone sat on the flat stone beside her tent, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. Her stomach gnawed hollow, a steady ache that had started hours ago when she last refused May's bread. She stared at the ground between her boots, tracing cracks in the dirt with her eyes. Cochise stood closer now, 50 yards, maybe less, the nearest he had ever come. Still respectful space, still no threat. But the gap felt smaller, intimate, charged. He faced her direction without staring, blanket pulled tight against the cooling air, hands open at his sides. May Harlan approached from the shadows of the wagons, moving quick and quiet like a woman who knew she was being watched. In her hands, a single tin cup, water from the last barrel before the block. Her face was drawn, eyes red from dust, or tears, or both. She crouched beside Lila, voice a thread. "Last of it. Take it, please." Lila looked at the cup. The water shimmered, clear and cold. Her throat burned with want. But she shook her head once, slow. "No, May. If I take it, they'll say I'm still being fed. Still one of them. I can't." May's fingers tightened on the tin. She searched Lila's face, then nodded. Once, defeated. She set the cup down anyway, as though leaving it might change something. Then she stood, shawl slipping from one shoulder, and walked away without another word. Across the flat, near the main fire pit, Elias Thorne stood with Harlan Wade and Jed Cole. Their voices carried in fragments on the still air. Low. Urgent. "If we don't settle this," Elias said, gravel in his tone, "this place dries up and blows away. We take her by force if we have to. No more waiting." Harlan nodded. Jed's hand rested on his gun belt, thumb brushing the buckle. The wind died for a moment, and in the sudden quiet, the whisper came, clearer than ever, drifting across the open ground like smoke. "You are safe." Lila closed her eyes. The words weren't just comfort anymore. They were proof of kindness holding out against the weight of everything else. She feared losing that more than she feared losing face. More than hunger. More than the settlement's anger. She stood slowly, legs unsteady from the day's emptiness, but she walked forward. 5 steps, maybe 6. The first time she had closed any of the distance herself. Cochise did not retreat. He stayed rooted, eyes lifting to meet hers. Patient. Steady. The same quiet strength that had carried him through nights colder than this. Lila stopped. The space between them still held. Sacred, unbroken, but it felt different now. Shared. She whispered, barely loud enough for the wind to carry. "I won't let you face this alone." From the edge of the settlement, May watched. Tears tracked silent down her cheeks, catching the last red light. She didn't move, didn't speak, just witnessed. Lila turned back toward the tent, steps slow, head high despite the tremble in her hands. A shadow detached from the wagons. Buck Harlan, stepping out of the gathering dusk. His revolver was already in his hand, low but ready, thumb on the hammer. He stopped 10 feet away, voice rough and low. "What the hell did you just do?" Lila froze. Buck's eyes flicked to Cochise, then back to her. "Harlan said if you get any closer to him, come morning we drag you out, and he won't be breathing to whisper anymore." The words hung there, heavy as lead. Buck didn't raise the gun. Didn't need to. The threat was in the quiet certainty of his stance. Lila stood between the tent and the man who had guarded her without ever claiming her. The dust settled slow around her boots. The last light bled from the sky, and somewhere out on the ridge, the 2 Apache shadows shifted, watching, waiting for whatever came next. The night deepened, thick and starless, the kind that swallowed sound, and left only the low crackle of the rider's fire near the tent. Flames licked at dry mesquite, throwing flickering orange light across the canvas walls and the ground between. Lila Boone lay on her pallet with the flap tied halfway open, letting the chill seep in along with the smell of burning wood and gun oil. Her stomach had stopped protesting hours ago. Now it was just a dull, empty weight. The settlement had gone dark, except for that one defiant glow. Jed Cole's camp. Lanterns low, voices murmuring like a slow river over stones. Cochise stood closer than ever before, not touching distance. Never that. But near enough that she could see the faint outline of his shoulders rise and fall with each measured breath, the blanket wrapped tight against the cold he refused to flee from. He had chosen this spot himself, after the riders arrived, after the stakes went in and the water dried up. A quiet claim without crossing the line. Voices drifted from the fire. Jed Cole's drawl, low and deliberate, talking to Buck Harlan. Morning comes, we take her. If that buck steps in the way, we got every excuse to sweep the remnant band clean. Take the land back proper. No more games. Buck grunted agreement, the metallic click of a cartridge being thumbed into a chamber punctuating the words. Lila's heart squeezed. She stared at the open flap, at the dark shape beyond it. May Harlan slipped through the shadows one last time, moving like she expected to be shot for it. She crouched just outside, face streaked with dust and tears, voice barely a breath. Lila, they'll kill him if you don't go. Harlan's set on it. Please. Lila sat up slowly. The blanket fell away. She looked at May, really looked, and felt the last tether to the settlement fray. I'm not going, she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Tell Harlan I choose to stay. May's breath hitched. Tears spilled fresh. She reached out, fingers brushing Lila's once, cold, desperate, then pulled back. She stood, turned, and walked away into the dark without looking back. The witness was gone, the last friendly face from the other side. Now there was only the night, the fire, and the man who had never asked her to choose him. Lila stared into the blackness. Running alone into the desert would save Cochise from the bullets meant for her. She could slip away before dawn, vanish into the flats, let them think she'd been taken or fled. But it would mean losing everything they had built, night by night, whisper by whisper. It would mean walking away from the one person who had seen her fear and answered with patience instead of power. She rose to her knees, leaned toward the open flap. I'm here, she whispered into the night, with you. A long silence answered. Then his voice came, low, certain, the first time he had spoken anything beyond the familiar phrase. I am too. The words landed soft, like rain on parched earth. Then the whisper followed, one last time in the dark. You are safe. Not reassurance anymore. A vow. Lila lay back, eyes open, listening to the fire pop and the wind sigh through the sage. The night held still, heavy with what was coming. Dawn crept in slow and pale, gray light bleeding across the flats. Hooves shifted in their remuda. Metal clicked, rifles being checked, chambers spun. Harlan Wade's voice rolled out from the riders' camp, loud and final. Lila Boone, this is your last chance. Come out now, or we come in and take you, and he dies right in front of you. Lila stood. Her hands shook, but her eyes were clear. She stepped to the flap, pushed it wider, and looked out at the line of men, at the guns leveled, at Cochise standing steady in the growing light. The moment had arrived. The dawn broke raw and unforgiving over the flats, the sun a thin red line that bled across the horizon and turned the dust to fire. Lila Boone pushed the tent flap wide and stepped out into the light, boots sinking into sand, still cool from the night. The settlement ringed her tent in a loose half-circle. Harlan Wade at the center, Jed Cole on his right. Buck Harlan a step behind with the revolver already drawn and steady. Riders flanked them, rifles cradled in the crooks of arms, faces hard under hat brims. Elias Thorne stood at the edge, arms folded, eyes narrowed against the glare. May Harlan lingered near him, shawl clutched tight, face pale as bone. In the open ground between the tent and the line of men stood Cochise, alone, closer than he had ever been, no more than 10 feet from Lila. Blanket draped over one shoulder, hands empty at his sides, he faced the riders without flinching. The wind stirred dust around his boots, carrying the faint scent of sage and gunpowder. Harlan's voice cut through the hush, rough and final. "Lila Boone, step out here. If that buck tries to stop us, we'll shoot. And his remnant band loses every acre they've got left for sheltering a traitor." Jed Cole worked the lever on his rifle with deliberate slowness, the metallic snick echoing in the still air. Buck Harlan leveled his revolver at Cochise's chest, finger resting light on the trigger guard, eyes flat. Lila's heart slammed against her ribs. She could still turn back, walk straight to Harlan, let them take her, save Cochise from the bullet that had his name on it. It would keep the fragile peace of the settlement intact, spare the remnant band the final sweep. But it would mean betraying the one quiet truth she had found in the dark, that kindness could stand against fear without raising a hand. She took the step, then another. Out into the open, hands empty, no weapon, no shield. The settlement watched, some with pity, some with disgust, most with the weary resignation of people who had seen too many lines drawn in the dust. She stopped beside Cochise, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cold morning air, but not touching. The distance they had always kept remained, honored, sacred, even now. Harlan's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, girl." Lila lifted her chin. Her voice came out steady, though her hands shook at her sides. "I'm here because I choose to be, not because I'm afraid, not because anyone forced me." Cochise inclined his head. Just a fraction, enough to acknowledge her words. His voice followed, low and measured, carrying across the wind without effort. "And I, because of the promise." And he raised both hands slowly, palms open, empty. No reach for the knife at his belt, no shift toward threat. Only the same quiet strength that had carried him through every night. "You are safe," he said, repeating the words slow and clear for everyone to hear. Not just for her, for all of us. The phrase rolled out across the flats, simple and unadorned, caught by the wind and scattered like seed. May Harlan pressed a hand to her mouth, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't speak. She only watched. Buck Harlan's finger tightened on the trigger. The hammer drew back with a soft, lethal click. Elias Thorne stepped forward fast, hand raised. "Hold!" His voice cracked sharp across the line. "Let her speak!" The riders froze. Harlan's jaw worked, eyes locked on Lila. Jed Cole's rifle stayed leveled, but his stance eased a fraction. The wind gusted once, whipping dust between them all, stinging eyes and throats. Lila stood beside Cochise, heart loud in her ears, the weight of every gaze pressing down. One wrong word now, one wrong move, and the ground would drink blood. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, waiting for someone to break it. The sun climbed high and merciless, turning the circle of men and dust into a furnace under the wide sky. Lila Boone stood in the center with Cochise, the space between them still a respectful arm's length, though the air felt thinner now, charged with the weight of every eye upon them. Harlan Wade faced them from the north, Jed Cole and Buck Harlan to his flanks, rifles and revolvers held low but ready. The riders formed a ragged ring, horses stamping restless behind them. Elias Thorne stood at the eastern edge, arms folded, face carved deep with lines of hard years. May Harlan lingered near him, shawl clutched like a lifeline, her gaze fixed on Lila. The wind had died to a low moan, carrying only the dry scent of sage and heated metal. No one spoke at first. The silence pressed in, thick as the heat. Lila drew breath, the words rising slow and painful from somewhere deep. "I saw it," she said, voice clear despite the tremble beneath. The quiet deal Harlan made, land traded for peace. But it broke. It led to blood, to the death of Cochise's family. I kept silent because I was afraid of what would happen if I spoke. But I'm speaking now because I trust something better than fear. She looked straight at Harlan. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened, eyes dropping to the dust at his boots. Cochise spoke then, low and steady, words measured like stones placed one by one. "I lost my wife, my child, because fear was left to grow too long. I whispered, so no one else would have to live inside that kind of dark." His voice carried across the circle, simple, without anger or plea. Just truth laid bare. May Harlan pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears tracked silent down her face. When the last word faded, the silence returned. Deeper. Heavier. Harlan lifted his head slowly. His mouth opened. Closed. No sound came. Buck Harlan turned his face away, shoulders rigid. Jed Cole muttered under his breath. Traitor. The word sharp, but low, swallowed by the wind. Lila felt the final thread snap. The settlement she had belonged to, however tenuously, was gone. No more shared fires, no more passing nods. She had traded it for something she couldn't name yet, and the cost burned fresh. Cochise glanced toward the ridge. The two shadows of his remnant band had withdrawn farther back, horses turning away slow. They accepted the risk, land still threatened, peace still fragile, but they gave him this moment. Harlan's hand flexed at his side. The revolver at Buck's hip stayed leveled. For a long heartbeat, the choice hung there. Pull the trigger. Keep the power. Lose every shred of honor in front of men who still remembered right from wrong. Or step back, lose control, but keep the thin line of humanity intact. Harlan exhaled, rough and ragged. "Today, we let it lie," he said. "But don't think we'll forget." He turned. The riders followed, rifles lowered, boots scuffing dust, horses wheeling slow. The circle broke. Dust rose in their wake, drifting lazy across the flats. May Harlan stepped forward then, quick and quiet. She reached Lila, wrapped her arms around her in a brief, fierce hug, warm, trembling, then pulled back. "I saw," she whispered, "and I'll remember." She turned to follow Harlan, but her eyes lingered on Lila until the dust swallowed her. Cochise lowered his head slightly toward Lila. "Thank you," he said, soft, "for listening." The words settled between them, simple and final, The rider's dust thinned, settled. The settlement receded into quiet. Lila and Cochise stood alone in the wide center of the flats. No embrace, no touch, only the shared space they had earned. Lila looked at him, throat tight. "We won," she whispered. "But why does it still feel like loss?" Cochise did not answer. He only turned his gaze to the horizon, where the sun burned steady and indifferent. The wind stirred again, lifting a thin veil of red dust between them, and the silence held, waiting, watchful, for whatever tomorrow would bring. Weeks passed slow and quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm has moved on, but left the ground still damp and scarred. The settlement returned to its fragile rhythm. Wagons creaked again on the water trail. Children ran between the tents. Cook fires smoked steady under the wide sky. But the edges had shifted. No one walked too close to the far rim where Lila Boone had pitched her new tent, small patched canvas, set apart, but not hidden. Cochise's shelter stood nearby, a simple brush wickiup under a lone piñon, close enough to see by starlight, far enough to honor what they had always kept. Lila woke sometimes in the dark hours, heart quickening for no reason she could name. The whispers had stopped. They had done their work, carried her through the nights of fear, and now the silence felt both empty and full. She would sit up, blanket around her shoulders, and listen to the wind move through the sage, half expecting the low voice to return. It never did. But the memory lingered, soft as an old scar that aches in cold weather. Cochise still kept watch on nights when the wind rose sharp. He would stand at the edge of the flat, blanket wrapped tight, facing the dark horizon as though listening for something only he could hear. Not guarding in the old way, just there, a habit carved too deep to erase. May Harlan never came close anymore. But sometimes, when the light was right, Lila would catch her silhouette at the settlement's rim, watching from afar, shawl pulled tight, face unreadable. May carried the story now, unspoken, but heavy. Travelers passing through heard it from her lips, quiet and careful, the way one tells a thing too true to shout. Rusty Kane, a lean man with dust in his beard and stories in his saddlebags, stopped one evening by the main fire. May spoke to him low, words drifting on the smoke. "There was a woman," she said, "not taken, but chosen, and an Apache who used words instead of bullets. They stood against everything, fear, anger, the pull of old blood, and something held. Not easy, not perfect, but it held." Rusty listened, nodded slow, then rode on. The tale traveled with him, carried on the wind to other fires, other nights. One still evening, when the sky burned low and gold, Lila stepped out of her tent. Cochise was already there, standing in the open ground between their shelters. No words at first, just the shared quiet. The air smelled of cooling earth and distant pine, the day's heat bleeding away into dusk. He turned to her. His voice came soft, the same measured cadence that had once carried her through fear. "You are safe." Not a reassurance, not a need, just memory, spoken one last time, like laying a stone on a cairn. Lila's lips curved, small, sad, real. "I know," she whispered, "and you are too." They stood there as the light faded, no promises spoken, no arms reaching, only presence, close, steady enough. The wind rose gentle, lifting thin veils of red dust that swirled between them and drifted west. Under the wide western sky, where stars began to prick the deepening blue. They watched the horizon together. No grand vows, no embrace to seal the moment. Just two people who had chosen each other against every force that said they shouldn't. The dust settled slow. The night deepened. And somewhere far off, the faint echo of hooves faded into silence, reminding them both that peace was never certain, only chosen, day after day, in a world that still remembered how to break. The light dimmed. The wind sighed once more, and the flats held their breath. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process, but every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission.